The Gospel of Matthew, Introduction. At this point in our course, we have already been looking at Matthew's Gospel in considerable detail. And so this lecture is not intended to cover as fully as one might expect an introduction to Matthew's Gospel. There are several themes I want to touch on, though, in addition to what we've gone over already and in addition to what your textbook has covered. Commentators point out that the Gospel of Matthew shows a number of Jewish features, and these suggest that the provenance for Matthew's Gospel is somewhere in the region of Palestine. It doesn't have to be specifically in Israel or in Judea or Galilee. It could be further north in a place like Antioch in Syria, but somewhere in that kind of context. There are several reasons for that, and there are quite a few reasons for that, which leads most scholars to make this conclusion. One of those has to do with the number of Old Testament references. This happened to fulfill what was spoken of by the prophet saying, and then we have a quotation from the Old Testament. Often when you're reading along in Mark, Matthew will insert an Old Testament quotation into what he has found in Mark's Gospel, and that is his editing of Mark and his addition to Mark. So more interaction with the Old Testament has suggested to some scholars that this is a more Jewish context. It's interesting sometimes when you read Paul's letters that letters like Galatians and Romans have many Old Testament references, whereas there are not so many when the letter doesn't necessarily have a Jewish audience, like in Colossians, for example. Now that is a very dangerous kind of argument to make. It's the way some thinking has gone on this, but in Romans and Galatians, Paul is dealing with a very specific Jewish issue, and the issue that he's dealing with in Colossians, in the Colossian church, may simply be such that the Old Testament does not need to be referenced as much. So it might not have anything to do with where the letter is written or what kind of church it is, but rather the topics that are there. So we have to look for other reasons than just Old Testament references in Matthew's Gospel to suggest a Jewish context. Another example might be the story of the raising of the 12-year-old girl from the dead in Matthew 9. Now, what's interesting here is that in Mark's Gospel, in chapter 5, verse 41, Mark actually uses the Aramaic word that Jesus speaks when he raises the girl. But Matthew doesn't do that. Now, on many occasions, we might say, well, now there's proof that Matthew isn't in a Jewish context. He's actually moving away from the use of Aramaic. Well, there are several reasons not to conclude that. And one of them is that Matthew will also use Aramaic on other occasions. It's only in this instance that he doesn't. So perhaps in this instance, the reason for not using Aramaic is that he simply wants to shorten Mark, as he often does. And then the other reason, which is more significant to note, is that Matthew sometimes quotes the Old Testament from the Aramaic. Robert Gundry has written a book on Matthew's use of the Old Testament, and he says that in Matthew 25, 35, and 36, and in Matthew 26, verse 52, we have quotations from Isaiah that actually come from the Aramaic translation of the Old Testament. The Aramaic translation of the Old Testament is called a Targum. So when you see the word Targum, it simply means an Aramaic translation of the Old Testament, Aramaic being the language spoken by the Jews in Israel at the time of Jesus, a language very close to Hebrew, but slightly different, and that difference comes from Israel's being in captivity in Babylon, where the language has picked up some of the Babylonian grammar and words. The use and targums is the plural for the word targum, and sometimes you see the Aramaic plural targumim, im instead of the s at the end. So that is something to look out for as you read commentaries from now on and see that word in print. It's referring to the Aramaic translations, which are around at the time of the 1st century and are being used by people in this Israelite context. In this context we're suggesting is the context where Matthew's Gospel is written. You wouldn't expect Aramaic targums to be used even in Jewish communities that are, for example, in Ephesus or in Rome. That is too far removed from that context of Israel. Now, there are also some Jewish settings for some of the stories. Unlike Mark, the author does not say that Jesus declared all foods clean. We've already commented on that in a previous lecture. But that Mark says that in his context in Rome or Italy makes perfect sense. He's writing in a much more cosmopolitan context where many of the Christians are Gentile Christians. They're also Jewish Christians. So Mark makes the point that Jesus is actually one interpretation of what Jesus says about what makes a person clean is to say that food laws are not to be followed anymore by the Christian church. Matthew, following Mark's gospel, decides to omit that comment by Mark, and therefore it makes much more sense to read Matthew in a more Jewish context. Matthew also eliminates from Mark the possibility of women divorcing their husbands. In Mark 10:12, both options are to be found, if the husband divorces the wife or the wife divorces the husband. But in a Jewish context, men divorce their wives. Now, we can find some very rare exceptions of this. For example, Herod Antipas's wife had divorced her husband so that she could marry Herod Antipas. But they're not particularly Jewish. After all, it's an Idumean family that the Herods are from, and also they're just a different kind of person. It's like talking about morality here in America through the lenses of whatever is presented in Hollywood. Those two just don't connect. We've also found an example of a Jewish woman filing for divorce in a text, an Aramaic text that comes from Egypt, in this island region called Elephantine. So we can find some exceptions to this, but women typically did not and could not divorce their husbands. So Matthew's decision not to give both options that Mark does seems to be a result of his writing for a context where that just didn't happen. The affirmation in Matthew's gospel that scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat suggests a Jewish context. Now, obviously, Jesus spoke those words in Matthew 23 in a Jewish context. He's actually in Jerusalem when he says that. So that is possibly an argument that isn't very strong. What scholars who have seen some substance to this argument have been thinking is that Matthew would not have said that if, in fact, it wasn't still somehow relevant for the community at the time of writing. I'm not so sure that's a very good argument myself, though. Another argument is that persecution in the synagogues is mentioned in chapter 10 and in chapter 23. And again, like the previous example, this is suggested to some scholars that persecution in the synagogues is still happening for disciples of Jesus. They are still in the synagogues. Again, that whole suggestion is based on trying to read the gospel in terms of when the gospel may have been written, rather than for what it's actually saying, and that is a word of Jesus in the time of Jesus. So I think once again that's a rather weak argument. In Matthew 15 verses 1 and 2, we have another omission from Mark's gospel, from Mark 7, 1 to 5. And here we have, in these longer verses in Mark's gospel, an explanation of the Jewish ritual of cleansing. Matthew does like to shorten Mark, but if he had been writing for a Gentile audience, it's very likely that he would have kept that explanation of the Jewish ritual of cleansing rather than omit it. Since it doesn't need to be explained to a more Jewish audience in context, Matthew omits it. I think that's another good, strong argument for saying that Matthew is written in the region of Israel, possibly in Antioch, possibly in Syria, but also possibly right in Israel. Another example is the language that we find in Matthew's gospel, and a good example is one we've already gone over when we talked about the kingdom of God, where Matthew hardly ever uses that phrase. But the typical phrase that we find in Matthew's gospel is kingdom of heaven. And if Matthew is copying Mark, he is following Mark as a source, then this is a change on Matthew's part. And it's a change then, as it would be understood, it's a change in the direction of what would sound better in a more Jewish context. Now let's have a look at the author. We call it Matthew's Gospel. Gospels did not have a signature. This is written by Matthew. It's not in the text. You don't find anything that says, I am the author, my name is Matthew. So the identification of Gospels with certain names, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is due to titles of the works. And the question then is, when were titles given to the Gospels? We can talk about that at another point in the course, but what is important here to note is that the title should not be read as if it's part of the original text. There are many things like that in Scripture as we read it in our translations. We have names for different pericope that the editors put in, and it would be wrong to assume that those names are part of the original. That's just what the editor has decided to call that. Like in Matthew 19, you have the pericope of the rich young ruler, and in some translations, and that's actually a mistake. In Matthew, it's a rich young man, not a rich young ruler. So be careful about those kinds of insertions in the text, and certainly don't accept them as part of the original. So too with titles of authorship here. That's also why you often find people who are adamant that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. Well, that's because their translation says Paul wrote the book of Hebrews, but that's not part of the original. Now, Martin Hengel says that Gospels did not circulate without titles. This is a new argument in 1985. Up until this point, people have been saying presenting things the way I just did, that we don't have these titles as part of the original. His evidence for this is, first of all, he says Tertullian, at the end of the 2nd and beginning of the 3rd century AD, expected Gospels to have titles. So he criticized the heretic Marcion in the middle of the 2nd century for composing his own Gospel from the Gospel of Luke and not having a title for it. Then secondly, when more than one Gospel circulated, it would have been necessary to distinguish them with a title. So this need would have been present already in the 1st century, since there's more than one Gospel in the 1st century. Oh, which Gospel are you talking about? Oh, the one written by Mark. Oh, no, the one written by Matthew. And then thirdly, the evidence in the 2nd century is unanimous that Matthew's Gospel is from Matthew. There aren't different designations for that Gospel. And he's identified as Matthew, the tax collector, also called Levi in Mark 2:14, and therefore possibly from a priestly family. Well, Martin Hengel's argument has a lot of merit to it. It doesn't necessarily argue that the gospel was given a title right at the time of its publication, but it does argue that very early on the Gospels would have been given their titles, and by very early on he means in the 1st century. And if something is given a title in the 1st century, then there's a very strong argument for saying that enough people in the church would have still been alive to have been able to correct any misdesignation of the author. So if a gospel in the 1st century is called the Gospel of Matthew, then people would have been able to say, yes, indeed, we know the story, we know how it was written by Matthew. So Hengel's argument then is that we should give considerable attention to these titles as strong early historical witness to who wrote the Gospels. Well, Richard Bauckham has written a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and his argument here is that our Gospels are written by eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry. He says each of our Gospels relies on eyewitness testimony. The anonymous authors show this eyewitness testimony by including names of the eyewitnesses in their accounts and by mentioning key witnesses at the beginning and end of the Gospel. So in the Gospel of Mark, we have Peter mentioned in verse 16 of chapter 1 and in verse 7 of chapter 16. Remember, Mark's Gospel ends in verse 8 of chapter 16. So the mention of Peter as at the beginning and the end is a way of indicating that the testimony that has been read in Mark's Gospel is an eyewitness testimony. Also in Luke's Gospel, Bauckham says that we have the women's testimony, women mentioned by name in Luke chapter 8 verses 1 to 3, and then also toward the end of the Gospel in chapter 23:55 and 24:10, the last chapter. We also have Simon Peter mentioned at the beginning and end, chapter 5. Remember, the first few chapters are taken up with the infancy narratives, and then the baptism and genealogy of Jesus. Chapter 4 has Jesus' first sermon in Nazareth, but after, when we get to chapter 5, we have the first mention of Simon Peter. And then right at the end of Luke, we also have Simon Peter in 24:34. Also mentioned in Acts 1 and Acts 11. Bauckham also points out that there is an anonymous beloved disciple who gives eyewitness testimony in the Gospel of John. And this anonymous person is mentioned in chapter 1, verses 35 and following, and in chapter 21, verse 2. We can talk more about that part when we get to John's Gospel. And then in Matthew, in chapter 4, we have the disciples mentioned by name in verses 18 to 22. Several disciples mentioned in that passage, which comes right after what the content of Jesus' message was in chapter 4:17, the message on the kingdom of heaven. And so the disciples are mentioned right after that so that the reader knows that we have eyewitness testimony in Matthew's gospel. And then they're gathered, the 11 are gathered in verse 16 of chapter 28 to receive instructions from the risen Christ that they are to become disciples to all nations. And Matthew is mentioned by name. The name is changed from Levi in Mark's gospel to Matthew in chapter 9, verse 9. And so the argument is that Matthew is using his preferred name and is the author here. Notice, though, that what we haven't proven is that Mark wrote Mark's gospel, or that Luke wrote Luke's gospel, or that John wrote John's gospel, or that Matthew is the author in Matthew's gospel. Rather, what Bauckham has shown here is that the most important thing about our gospel authors is that they are eyewitnesses, and they are giving eyewitness testimony to the events. And that, I think, really does put the emphasis where it needs to be. A look at date and purpose of writing for Matthew's gospel can be broken up into we can learn about dating Matthew's gospel from texts outside of Matthew's gospel and from inside Matthew's gospel, from reading the text itself. As to outside the text of Matthew's gospel, we want to look for the earliest use of Matthew in the 2nd century. Ignatius writes several letters on his way to Rome early in the 2nd century. He goes to martyrdom. He is possibly en route to Rome as early as something like 108 and perhaps as late as 118 AD, but it's early on in the 2nd century. And in his letter to the Ephesians, he seems to be aware of Matthew's gospel when he says the tree is known by its fruit, one argument goes. Also, Polycarp, living at the same time, seems to be aware of Matthew 10:16, wise as serpents and harmless as a dove, is the quote we find in Polycarp 2:2. The Didache is a writing that is also known as the teaching of the 12 apostles. It's possibly written as early as the 90s AD. And in the beginning of the Didache, like in Matthew 7, we hear about two ways that a person can take, the wide way and the narrow way. And it also has a version of the Lord's Prayer that is similar to Matthew 6. Remember, Matthew and Luke have the Lord's Prayer, Luke 10, and there are differences between Matthew 6 and Luke 10. And the Didache seems more closely related to Matthew. Is it possible that the Didache knows Matthew's gospel? Now, this evidence isn't certain, but it is somewhat is often considered strong enough to reach the conclusion that Matthew's gospel is written before Ignatius. Now, that argument is separate from any argument as to authorship. So obviously, if Matthew is the author, the time of writing has to be in the 1st century. Now, when we turn to any evidence in the text, it's important to understand that many scholars have approached the Gospels from a perspective of reading them at, you might say, two levels. One level in Jesus' day and the other level in Matthew's day. This is the kind of way this argument goes. If you read something in the Gospels, you can ask, does it make sense at the time of Jesus? Or is something said that just doesn't sound like it fits the time of Jesus and it might fit a later time? Is there something, secondly, in the gospel that would better fit the time of Matthew when he writes the gospel for his audience than for the time of Jesus when Jesus speaks to his audience? Okay, so we have these two levels to consider. Now, I'm going to suggest that this kind of reading is very tenuous, but I want to present some of the evidence because whenever you read commentators and journal articles, this issue frequently comes up, not just in Matthew's gospel, but in all the gospels. Can you detect things that are appropriate for a later time or in Jesus' time? So let's look at some examples of how this might relate to the date and purpose question of Matthew's gospel. One scholar by the name of Reinhard Hummel has argued that Matthew's church, so remember now he's talking about the time of Matthew's writing and the audience that Matthew wrote for. Matthew's church was at odds with the Pharisees, but had not yet left the synagogue. So he's reading Matthew's gospel at the level of Matthew and his audience. He says they haven't left the synagogue because he's still recording stories that make sense prior to the destruction of the temple, but not afterwards. So Matthew inserts into Mark's gospel a story unique to Matthew in Matthew 17:24-27 about payment of the temple tax. And then in Matthew 23:2-3, we have the scribes and Pharisees who sit on Moses' seat. They should be listened to, says Jesus. Don't do what they do, but do what they say. Would that make sense at a later time? Would Matthew have recorded those words for his church if the situation had moved on? Then we have Matthew 10:17 and 23:34, which talk about the fact that the disciples will be persecuted in the synagogues. Now, if that is a possibility, then surely the disciples in Matthew's day are still in the synagogues. Does that make sense to you? I hope you can see the argument, but I hope you can also have some critical distance from the argument and say, well, are we to read the Gospels at the level of Matthew and his audience, or are we to read them at the level of Jesus in his times? And obviously, if it's Jesus in his times, then these passages refer in passages, the previous one, chapter 23, and then these in chapter 10 and 23 again, would make sense in Jesus' time, whether or not they made sense in Matthew's time. So Hummel concludes that the Gospel of Matthew is for a Jewish Gentile community and calls Hellenist libertines, those who want to break from the law, back from their lawlessness, back to obeying the law. Now, one example of this is one that I've added in square brackets here. It's one that we've already noted, where in Mark chapter 7, Mark talks about Jesus' views on cleanliness, and in Mark 7, there is a parenthetical remark by Mark that says, and so Jesus declared all foods clean. So the laws in the Old Testament about what foods to eat and not eat are no longer applicable. And we saw that in Matthew 15:19, when Matthew gets to that point in Mark's gospel, he excludes that parenthetical statement. One of the arguments for a Jewish audience. So is Matthew trying to call back a group of Hellenists from their libertine views and say, no, the law still is applicable to you? Well, over on, against that is an argument by another German scholar, Georg Strecker, who says that Matthew's community had broken with Judaism by the time of the writing of Matthew's gospel. You find language like their scribes or their synagogues, referring to the Jews. It doesn't seem to include the Christians. Furthermore, he argues that Matthew intensifies the polemical references in Mark to the Pharisees. The Pharisees are certainly a negative example in Mark's gospel, but in Matthew, that perspective is intensified. Does this then possibly reflect a later situation in the church when the synagogues are excluding Christians from them? I'll say a bit more about that shortly. And then in Matthew, only Judas uses the title rabbi, whereas Mark has used it of Jesus himself. But in Matthew 23, verses 7 to 8, Jesus says to his disciples that they are not to use the title rabbi for themselves. Is this reflecting a later period toward the end of the first century when Jews began to redefine who they were, and this is the time of the birth of what we call rabbinic Judaism in the 90s, perhaps starting as early as 85 and following. And then finally, with Strecker's argument, Matthew is open to the Gentile mission, and he thinks that might be reflective of a later time. Well, I hope you can, without picking them apart one by one, I hope you can have a sense of these arguments are not all that strong on one side or the other. And perhaps there's a little credence that you can give to some arguments by Hummel, and then Strecker, perhaps there's something there. But really the question I think to ask is that the best way to read Matthew's gospel? As if the primary context is Matthew and his audience, rather than, as good history ought to be, the primary context is Jesus and his context and his time. Now, the idea of an audience and a gospel writer writing to that audience has dominated the scholarship of the 20th century. And right at the end of the 20th century, in 1998, Richard Bauckham edited a book called The Gospels for All Christians, Rethinking the Gospel Audiences. So much of scholarship focused on whether or not, say for example, Matthew was written for a Jewish audience only, or was Mark written for a mixed audience, or was Luke written for a Gentile audience, and so forth, or was an author writing just for the churches in Asia. And there was this sense that you can really find different versions of Christianity in different parts of the Christian world in the first century, because these communities weren't interacting with each other, the assumption seemed to be. And later they do, and so the material gets spread around and copies are made for different parts of the church. But while you're in the first century, you can isolate the communities, and you can isolate the literature and the authors that write for those communities. What Bauckham and others have questioned is whether right from the start, what they've argued is that right from the start, the Gospels are really written for all Christians. They have a wide audience in view. Now, what he also argues then is that the idea of witness is the primary focus, that the Gospels are written as testimonies by reliable witnesses for the church, which means that the focus is on the history rather than on the author and his later audience. Going back to 1964, a very influential book, for example, argued that Matthew was written for a specific time and place. W.D. Davies' book, The Setting on the Sermon on the Mount, argued that Matthew's Gospel is written at the same time that Judaism is redefining itself at Jamnia or Yavne in Israel. Because the Sadducees had come to an end and the Essenes had come to an end with the destruction of the temple and the war against Rome, the question is, how is Judaism to be defined? If many had thought of Judaism as a religion that relates to Jerusalem, that relates to the temple, that relates to the sacrifices at the temple, that relates to the priesthood and the Levitical line from which the priests come, meant that now we have to look at how to understand Judaism in a post-AD 70 way. And the Pharisees were equipped to do that. The Pharisees were not part of the Levitical or priestly group. The Pharisees had focused on interpreting the law and obeying the law. And the synagogues are the places where the law was read and interpreted. And so the Pharisees are the ones who can redefine Judaism around the law and the synagogue now that the temple is destroyed. Two groups survived the destruction of the temple. The larger group were Jews led by the Pharisees, who came to be called the rabbis. The smaller group, much smaller group, were Christians who had already predicted Jesus had already predicted the destruction of Jerusalem. Jesus had already critiqued the temple and called for its cleansing and so forth. So the Christians are in a good position post AD 70 to say our version of Judaism is correct. And the Pharisees are the other group. So as the Pharisees redefined Judaism at Jamnia in about 85 to 95, the argument has gone that they came up with 18 benedictions for the synagogue service. And the 12th benediction states this: let Nazarenes and heretics or minim perish in a moment. So this is a curse. And the point is that no Christian could say that, because the Christians are the Nazarenes. The Christians are those who follow Jesus of Nazareth. Now, if that's the case, then what we have here is a post-AD 70 writing of Matthew's Gospel at the time of the rabbis defining Judaism. And what Matthew is a defining of Judaism in a Christian way over against what the rabbis were doing. Now, this argument, written back in 1964, held sway for decades. But you see, it's this kind of position that those writing in the book edited by Bauckham on the previous slide, The Gospels for All Christians, is questioning whether we really can get down to that kind of specificity to locate the author and his audience. One more point about the 12th benediction and these benedictions is that subsequent scholarship has been rather critical of whether we can actually date these benedictions to the 1st century at all, and whether they don't belong in the 2nd century. There have been other criticisms of the viewpoint too. The present state of the debate is that this really is not a strong argument anymore. It's not absolutely impossible, but most scholars are no longer putting any eggs into this basket of the 12th benediction, and happening at all in the first century, or at all possibly having an influence on Matthew's gospel, or for that matter, later when we talk about John's gospel and its dating. I mention all of this, go into it at some depth, not because we get great solutions out of it, but because so much of scholarship addresses these issues and much of it depends on it. So when you pick up older commentaries or you pick up new commentaries that are still addressing these issues, now you'll be able to understand what's going on and what the debates are. My conclusion is we really don't know when these books were written. But what we can say is that they were written by eyewitnesses. We can say that they were written in the first century. We can say that Matthew's gospel is written after Mark's gospel. And that's quite a lot to say. We can also say that there's good reason to say that Matthew is the author of Matthew's gospel. The purpose of Matthew can also be seen in his editing of Mark's gospel. And what the final slides will look at is Matthew's purpose that we can discover in his structure. This is how he structures his gospel. One thing we won't spend time is on how Matthew provides a structure to Mark's gospel that helps the reader understand Jesus and his message. That is, we're not going to spend detailed time on the differences between where the stories are found in Matthew and where they're found in Mark, but that's something to pay attention to, as we pointed out already. Then secondly, Matthew expands Mark's gospel, particularly with more of what Jesus taught. Most of what so-called Q is teaching material, for example, and we have these discourses in Matthew's gospel. These are the kinds of expansions that we're talking about. Then thirdly, Matthew wants to interpret Jesus with respect to the Old Testament. Then Matthew wants to show Jesus in relationship to the law. That is, that Jesus fulfills the law. He doesn't oppose it. He interprets it, but he doesn't speak against it and abrogate it. And then Matthew wants to explain how Jesus relates to Israel and to the Gentiles. One of the significant developments in Matthew's gospel is from chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, to chapter 28, verses 18 and through 20. In chapter 10, Jesus sends the 12 disciples out to the towns of Israel and only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Whereas in Matthew 28, in the Great Commission, the 11 disciples are now sent out to all nations. And this theme of how the gospel goes to the Gentiles is found really throughout Matthew's gospel, starting as early as the time when the Magi come in chapter 2 to the baby Jesus in Bethlehem. So as you read Matthew's gospel, look for how there is a development in the narrative that focuses on Jesus coming to Israel to proclaim the return of exile to the Jews in the first century in a spiritual sense, and then how that includes Gentiles like the centurion or the woman up in the region of Tyre and Sidon and so forth, and ultimately ends up with a mission to the nations. One thing I would say about Matthew's gospel is that Matthew believes that Jesus has fulfilled the mission to Israel. He has elected 12 disciples. They represent restored Israel from captivity, and so now Israel, having been restored in a sense, can go on its mission that it has had ever since the time of Abraham, the covenant with Abraham, to the Gentiles. They can go out and become a blessing to the Gentiles by making disciples of them as well. There's still a hope in Matthew 23:39 that there will come a time when Israel itself will say to Jesus, "Blessed, Hosanna," or "Blessed to the Son, blessed to the one who comes in the name of the Lord." I'm relating what Jesus says in Matthew 23 to what happens a few chapters earlier when Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey and they say, "Hosanna to the Son of David." Well, by the time you get to the end of 23, Jesus has been rejected. And so Jesus says, "Well, you won't see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" So that seems to offer some hope to Jerusalem, even as chapters 24 and 25 point to a coming time of judgment and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Okay. So one way we can get at purpose then is to look at how Matthew has edited and brought out new themes and so forth with respect to Mark's gospel. Our next examination then will continue the idea of purpose, but the main focus will be on the question, what kind of structure? Now, turning to structure, we can begin with the theory of B.W. Bacon from the early part of the 20th century, the 5 books theory. What he noted was that there is a formula that is repeated 5 times in Matthew's gospel. The formula is this: when Jesus finished saying these things. That formula is found after 5 discourses in Matthew's gospel. After the Sermon on the Mount, after the missionary discourse in chapter 10, after the parables of the kingdom, after the so-called ecclesiastical discourse in chapter 18, and then after the Olivet or eschatological discourse in chapters 24 and 25. Now, one problem with this theory is that you have to say, what about the discourse in chapter 23? Is that to be taken as part of the discourse with chapters 24 and 25? In chapter 23, we read the woes to the scribes and Pharisees in Jerusalem that are delivered publicly by Jesus. In chapters 24 and 25, we have the Mount of Olives discourse privately with the disciples on the issue of the destruction of Jerusalem and really the apocalyptic teachings of Jesus about the end times. And so is this only one speech? And if it's not one speech, then perhaps do we not have 2 discourses between chapters 23 and then 24 and 25? And if we don't have anything like this saying, when Jesus finished saying these things after this speech in chapter 23. Now, there are different views on how to handle that, but what Bacon was suggesting was that Matthew has intentionally formulated 5 discourses so that Jesus can be set up as the new Moses in comparison to the 5 books of the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And Jesus is the new Moses over against the original Moses. I think there are many problems with Bacon's theory. It's based on this idea of a formula. The formula is obviously there. Is it actually a structural formula, though? And I don't think it is. Many to this day still follow that argument, and this is one of the theories that is out there. I don't think this theory, though, really gets at the heart of the structure of Matthew's gospel at all. The formula for me really is just the kind of thing Matthew says after Jesus has had a speech. And it's not even something that's said after all the speeches, as in 23. A more recent theory of the structure of Matthew's gospel is what's come to be known as the 2 pivotal points theory of Jack Kingsbury and David Bauer. David Bauer was a student of Jack Kingsbury, This theory looks at another phrase that we find in Matthew's Gospel. From that time Jesus began. It occurs in chapter 14, verse 17, when after we get to the point where Jesus is in Capernaum, we read, from that time on, he began to preach, repent, the kingdom of heaven is near. And then in chapter 16, verse 21, what do we find in chapter 16? Well, in this chapter, we have Peter's confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, and so forth. And then in verse 21, right after that, Jesus said, the text says, from that time on, Jesus began to tell them that the Son of Man must go to Jerusalem, suffer and die, and on the third day be raised from the dead. That's the first passion prediction. So we move to a new understanding of Jesus from 1621, where now he is presented as the Son of Man who must suffer and die. So this then breaks up Matthew's Gospel into three sections, up through 4:16, up through 16:20, and then 16:21 and following. Now, following Kingsbury, David Bauer argues that this can break the gospel down into understanding. The first section is being about the person of Jesus the Messiah. The middle section is the proclamation of Jesus the Messiah. And the third and last section is the passion of Jesus the Messiah. Now, some problems with this is that the theory, I think, is just too simplistic for such a highly structured gospel. It's not that you can't handle Jesus' identity in this way, according to these three broad descriptions, but they're just so broad that they don't seem to me to be what Matthew intended when he sat down to outline how he was going to arrange the material. There's much more to it than that. And we've already had some discussion of this in earlier lectures. Another kind of issue that we can look at is not the major structure of the gospel, but the minor structure of the gospel. What smaller issues can we see? And we see that Matthew does do a lot of things that indicate structure at a smaller level. W.D. Davies and Dale Allison have pointed out a lot of these in their 3-volume commentary on Matthew's Gospel. They show that Matthew shows an interest in numerical structuring, for example. He especially likes groupings of 3. So, for example, in chapter 6, we have 3 acts of piety that are illustrated: almsgiving, prayer, and fasting, the Sermon on the Mount. Or he also likes groups of 7. There are 7 petitions in the Lord's Prayer. There are 7 parables in chapter 13 on parables of the kingdom. There are 7 woes to the scribes and Pharisees in chapter 23. And the genealogy has 3 times 14. That is, we have Abraham to David, David to the exile and return, and from the exile and return to Jesus. And within each of those 3, there are 14 generations. A thematic arrangement has been suggested by a variety of commentaries, and this is also my view. And in this arrangement, I'm going to emphasize the word mission. So we have the beginning of Jesus' mission in 1:1 through 4:16. He is the one we learn in chapter 1 who is called Jesus because he is going to save his people from their sins. So we have already gone over that whole section in one whole lecture to explore the lenses of Abraham, David, and the exile and return for understanding Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament, Jesus as Israel. And then we moved in another lecture to look at Jesus' mission in word and in deed, as his mission of proclaiming the kingdom of God is described in the Sermon on the Mount, the ethics of the kingdom, and then in chapters 8 and 9, in terms of the authority of Jesus to perform miracles and to make disciples. And so, and we saw that there was a summary at the beginning and end, and therefore an inclusio in chapter 4:23 to 25 and 9:35. So Matthew has given us a very clear indication in this section that this is a section to be taken together. Then the next section is rather long. It's 9:36 to 17:23. And here we have the question of, is this a section? Should we break it up more? And is there some kind of a theme that holds it all together? And what I'm going to suggest to you is read these chapters in Matthew's Gospel in terms of the response to mission. Because in the previous chapters, we've had Matthew's description of Jesus' mission. And then in chapter 9:36, Jesus says that the fields are white to harvest. Pray to the Lord of the harvest to send forth laborers. And then we have the laborers mentioned by name, the 12 disciples, at the beginning of chapter 10. And then Jesus gives a speech in chapter 10 to them to go and do the kingdom ministry that Jesus had been doing in the previous chapters. So they are now extending the ministry of Jesus by doing exactly what he did. What is that? Well, they're to proclaim the good news of the kingdom. And secondly, they are to do the miracles of the kingdom to show that the kingdom power is present. And related to that, then they're to go to houses in village after village and town after town in Israel in order to make disciples. Okay, but in chapter 10, Jesus, although he sends the disciples out, the main thrust of his message to them in chapter 10 is that they should expect a certain response to their ministry. So that speech is really all about the responses that they're likely to receive. You know, if someone doesn't accept you in one place, shake off the dust on your feet and go on to another place. And then you'll be dragged before different leaders. You'll be beaten in the synagogues. These things will happen to you. The whole message in chapter 10 is about the kind of response that they're going to receive. And then in chapter 11, we have the question from John the Baptist that we went over in an earlier lecture. John's question is, what response are we supposed to give to you? Are you the one to come, or should we expect another? And that leads Jesus on to talk about other responses of the towns and villages where he had ministered. And that if those same works had been done in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented long ago. Okay, so then in chapter 11:25 to 12:50, we also looked a bit at that whole section and how that relates together. Responses to Jesus because he had been opposed because of his works on the Sabbath day. Well, the wise then are rejecting him, but the babies are accepting him. And who's an example of a babe? Well, it's the demon-possessed man who's blind. He can't even see. And who is deaf. He can't even hear. And yet he can hear better and see better than the Pharisees. So we went over that chapter that ends in chapter 12, verse 50. It ends with Jesus saying, who's my family? Well, my family, my mother, my brothers, and my sisters are those who do the words that I speak. Then we move on to the parables, and I call them even in this lecture, I've called them the parables of the kingdom. But now look at these 7 parables in chapter 13 again. They're really parables of response. The response of the soils, for example, to this kingdom ministry. What kind of soil are you? And so each of them can be read as a parable of response. Well, then in chapter 14 we have the response of Herod and of the crowd. This is where you have the feeding of the 5,000. Herod puts John the Baptist to death in this chapter too. And then in chapter 15, verse 1 to 16:13, we have some further responses of the Pharisees and scribes, and possibly also of the Gentiles. Certainly the woman in the region of Tyre and Sidon is a Gentile. Maybe the feeding of the 4,000 is a feeding that takes place in Gentile territory. And then Jesus and his disciples go up into the region of Caesarea Philippi. So then Jesus asks his disciples, well, first of all, what are people saying about me? So he's asking about response. And then he says, well, what do you say about me? And that's where Peter's confession comes. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, then Jesus gives his first prediction that the Son of Man will go to Jerusalem, suffer and die, and on the 3rd day be raised from the dead. He's again talking about the response that he's going to receive when he goes to Jerusalem. Then in chapter 17 comes the response of God. Jesus goes up on the Mount of Transfiguration, and we hear again, as at his baptism, the voice from heaven that says, "This is my beloved Son, hear him, listen to him." And then we have the question of the next pericope in 17:14 to 23 is probably part of the same story as the Transfiguration, because while you have this amazing experience of Jesus up on the mountain, down below you have the disciples unable to cast out the demon in the boy, and it's because of their weak faith. So the disciples are once again an example of a weak faith response to Jesus. And that seems to me then to be a way to understand how so many different stories can be grouped together in 936 to 1723 in terms of a response to the mission of the kingdom. Then we've had a whole lecture on the disciples' mission as little ones in 1724 to 2028. So we move on then to note that 2029 through 2546 is Jesus' mission challenged by Jerusalem. This is where Jesus rides into Jerusalem. He is opposed by the various leaders, everyone who's anyone in Judaism except for the Essenes are represented, and they oppose Jesus. Then comes Jesus' judgment of scribes and Pharisees in chapter 23, then the Mount of Olives discourse in chapters 24 and 25. After this, we have the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The mission is completed as Jesus goes to the cross, but is resurrected from the dead, and then commissions his disciples to go into all the world and make disciples to the end of the book. That seems to me to be the structure of Matthew's gospel. Now, what do you do with structure? Well, you begin to read stories in relationship to one another. What's the story before it? What's the story after it? What stories has Matthew included or excluded as he's copied from Mark? How has he dealt with a story differently from Mark or differently from Luke? And by paying attention to things like that, you begin to look at the purpose of the author. And as you do that, then you understand not only the historicity of the gospel as written by an eyewitness, but also the interpretation of the gospel. That is, perhaps those two ideas are best described in terms of the word witness. A witness can say what happened, but a witness can also point to the meaning of what happened. And so the Gospels are eyewitness testimonies in that sense. Now, another feature of Matthew's Gospel that we've already noted is Matthew's use of the Old Testament. And this is another way in which you can pay attention to the purpose in Matthew's Gospel. One thing the witness is doing is bringing out the significance of an event by placing it alongside Old Testament passages. And one feature in Matthew's Gospel is that a number of these Old Testament passages are introduced with the same kind of formula. This happened to fulfill what was spoken of by the prophet so-and-so saying. And so there are other quotations in Matthew's Gospel that aren't introduced that way. But those listed on this slide are introduced that way. And many of these come from the prophets. They're especially in chapters 1 and 2, but also they're throughout the Gospel in different chapters. So here we have the listing of where you find these different fulfillment quotations. They are in the events of Jesus' birth. They're in Jesus' entry into Galilee. They're with respect to his healing ministry, his having compassion and gentleness, his teaching in parables, his entry into Jerusalem, and then in the Passion and Death in chapters 26 and 27, again we have fulfillment quotations. Throughout Matthew, there are other Old Testament quotations, and there are allusions to the Old Testament as well as the quotes. Now, some of these come from Mark, but Matthew's Gospel expands Mark greatly in his engagement with the Old Testament. The way to read Matthew, then, is with your Old Testament open. And don't only read the passage that is quoted to, or perhaps the verse that might be alluded to, but read the context and see what else might relate in the context in the Old Testament passage to what Matthew is doing. He's not necessarily only referring you to the exact words quoted. And this then brings us to a conclusion to the additional things that I wanted to emphasize in your encounter with Matthew's Gospel. In the next lecture, we'll move on to look at Luke's Gospel and his unique contributions to the story of Jesus.